All right, I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Young. I'm from MBN Solutions, and a warm welcome to Ricardo tonight. He came on board to talk about the gaining strategic advantage with open source. So really looking forward to this one. We've heard Ricardo a few times speak in person in Glasgow, so really looking forward to it. Ricardo, I'll hand this straight over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just sort a few things out. I'm getting a bandwidth warning on my side, so I'm not sure if I'm appearing okay or my audio's okay. So I'll look to you to give me a cue to make sure everything's all right.
Okay.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. Fine at the moment.
Okay. So hello everyone. So yes, my name is Ricardo Sueiras. I'm a principal advocate at AWS, and I specialize in open source. So I think just to kind of like set the scene really, let me just turn my video off actually, so that I save my bandwidth. Okay, cool. Right, let's make sure this all works. I am actually going to make this interactive, okay? So if you've got your mobile phones handy, and you've got a QR code app reader, then if you don't mind getting that ready, because I've got a number of little polls that I'm going to be running through this just to gauge, kind of like your level of knowledge, your background, and I can try and focus the conversation accordingly. Because normally I do this in person and I can ask, and it's easy to sense from people, but doing it remotely, we've got to come up with new mechanisms. So why this talk? So for 20 years, the use and adoption of open source by both developers and businesses has been growing, and organizations of all sizes across all industries and from startups to the most regulated businesses now depend on open source software. Okay, and so this talk really is really about why open source is key to gaining strategic advantage for any company that is using or adopting technology in a meaningful way. So I'm going to make it interactive. So this is the first poll. Okay, so I'm using a tool called Slido. Some of you might be familiar with this, but by using your QR code, it should take you to a website where it will ask you some questions, and I will be able to see the kind of the outcome of those questions as you start doing it. So let me just make sure I can see that. Okay, I can see one person has done it, a couple of people. Okay, cool. So I'll give that just a few seconds just so I can gauge. So we get most people, looks like it's somewhat familiar. Okay, good. Right, this is kind of what I thought. So we'll be using this. I've got two other polls as well, so keep those mobile phones handy. So whilst open source is something that has emerged from sort of like this last 20 to 30 years, to really understand kind of the underpinning behaviors, as well as what makes open source so compelling, we have to look to the past. And, if we look all the way back to the first industrial revolution back in England, so the late 18th and 19th century, engineers would harness the collective invention for what they called the greater good. At the time, the country was competing with other nations. The UK wanted to become the greatest producer of steel. And so there was this kind of like overarching need as a nation to have better steel mills, more efficient steel mills. So they would create plans, these engineers build, and then share these during academic tours around the country, inviting feedback and suggestions for improvements. Now, this allowed new ideas and innovations. It lowered the barrier to entry for new engineers that wanted to work in this field. And it led ultimately to the building of more efficient and better iron mills and pumps. And here are two examples. Now, there is actually a research paper from 2005 that really dives deep into the historical background of kind of the similarities of how these engineers worked and their similarities to open source. But if we look to more recent times, and this timeline really is a journey through different typefaces, as I like to call it. We can sort of start looking back at kind of like the origins of what we call open source today, kind of very much from kind of the early 70s. And so long before the term existed, the concept of open source was very much alive. Now, the idea of open source was used by companies like DEC and IBM who wanted to sell hardware, but they lacked the required software. So engineers and academics would have meetups and they would share expertise and applications they had written on magnetic tapes. And if anyone's interested in looking more at that, there's a book called The Kingmakers that documents this, and the user group at the time called Share. In 1974, the Copyright Act was changed to incorporate source code. So before 1974, you could copy source code and it wasn't actually considered something that was copyrightable. So I'm just getting some chats here. Just want to make sure it's nothing to do with my audio. Okay, no, everything's okay. Everyone's all right. So apologies there, to make sure that it's not my issue, any issues from my side. So before 1974, you know, copyright didn't cover source code, but 1974 that changed. Okay, so source code was covered by copyright, but not the resulting bytecode that you got from compiling the code. So effectively, you could copyright the source code, but when you produced a program, that could still be shared with that, and it wasn't covered by copyright. That changed in 1983 to extend to cover the program that was actually compiled as a result. Okay, so this led to a significant shift in commercial activities in software, moving what had previously been thought of as a hobbyist and academic pursuit into a more commercial one. So what that meant was that it resulted in more software being made available under commercial terms, with no source code being made available. So this was 1983, right? And then this led ultimately in 1984 to the creation of what was called the Free Software Foundation, that wanted to address this lack of source code that it viewed as ethically wrong. But it wasn't until 1998 that the term open source was coined. And that came about from the analysis of how different types of free software were being developed. So for over 20 years, the Open Source Initiative, or OSI as it's called, has led the increased awareness and adoption of open source across both developers and businesses. So that's a very brief history, and it is important really to kind of like try and understand the background. So if we take kind of a closer look, open source was a shift away from free software to a more commercial and business-friendly way of applying the same principles. Because I think at the time, free software felt very much like a kind of an idealistic, maybe almost like a religious position. And it kind of scared a lot of more of the commercial aspects of it. So open source was a shift to kind of come up with some more commercial and business-friendly ways of applying the same principles. And on the left-hand side, we can see what the Free Software Foundation defined as what were fundamental to free software. And they call this thing the 4 freedoms. And it's something that when you work with open source, you'll hear a lot, the 4 freedoms of open source: the freedom to run software, the freedom to study it, the freedom to copy and distribute it, and then also the freedom to be able to modify it and change it. You know, whilst free software used those 4 freedoms as its litmus test for free software, the OSI set out that all open source licenses needed to adhere to the open source definition, which is the thing on the right-hand side here in this slide. And that's a set of 10 requirements that a license must have to qualify as open source. And today there are over 70 such licenses. Now, I'm not going to go into detail in this presentation, okay? So when we look really at what open source is today, it's really 2 things. Firstly, it's open source has emerged a way of reducing the friction for developers, providing a mechanism that allows developers to easily license the software they create under terms that follow open source principles and allow someone consuming that software to understand how they can use it. And it provides a standard definition framework for licensing, making it easy for everyone to understand. That's really, really important, okay? So the idea here is to remove the friction, remove the need to have legal people around, and give people more confidence that they can you know, license this software in a way that they understand and achieve what they want it to achieve. The second, and probably, you know, equally important, is it was a way that software was collaboratively developed. The supporting the tools and governance models, as well as the emergent frameworks and methodologies that also sprung up over time to support that. So that's kind of like how we can think of what open source is today. Now, from a business perspective, open source is a set of levers and tactics that you can use to achieve a number of different outcomes. And understanding what outcomes you are looking to achieve is really critical to ensuring how you leverage open source effectively. I think the danger is quite often a lot of people just assume open source is just technology, it's just software, but that is actually not the case. Successful open source business are successful because they run good businesses first and align open source mechanisms to outcomes. For example, it might be solving software engineering challenges, maybe entering or disrupting markets. And I'm going to come into more details of these later. Okay. And so once you know what you're looking to achieve with your open source project, you can now select the appropriate license to help you achieve the outcome. And we talk about this kind of freedom zero, the first freedom, which is actually whether you want to open source something or not. And I think this is really important. You know, you do not necessarily need to open source everything, and you should be sufficiently intentional in your approach. So I think I'll just say that again, just so that everyone's clear. Even though I'm an open source advocate, what I'm saying is that you shouldn't necessarily open source everything. Okay. You know, you need to be intentional. You need to understand what objective you hope to achieve by open sourcing a project. The other takeaway here is that open source is not a business model. Okay, there is this danger that people think that I'm going to build some open source software and then I'm going to make a business from it. You have to have a good idea of what your customer pain points are, what challenges you're trying to address first, create a business, and then use open source within that business. So let's look now a little bit more about kind of licenses software licenses and rights in a continuum. Okay, now this is a simplification, but I think it hopefully explains where open source sits kind of in this legal copyright continuum. So if we imagine on the left-hand side, we've got public domain where you effectively kind of relinquish all your rights, and then we've got proprietary and trade secrets on your right, where you keep everything close and you control everything. Open source sits in the middle, but it's not just one block, right? There are two types of open source licenses, and we call these permissive and copyleft. And the idea here is that you can be more permissive with the licenses you apply to your projects if you want to have less control over the project, or you can provide stronger controls by applying copyleft licenses. And within copyleft, you have strong copyleft licenses, which effectively have more requirements that are required for developers and obligations they need to meet, or weaker ones on the left. So again, that's requiring less obligations that developers need to follow. And again, I'm not going to go into details in this presentation on this, but this is just to set the background. Okay, so that's open source. Let me just make sure there's no questions on the stuff that I've talked about so far. So any questions coming up? Yeah, no questions so far. Good stuff. Okay, right. Okay. So open source is loved by developers. And there are lots of reasons. And again, I'm not going to go into, in this talk, I'm not going to talk about the developer side of things. Okay, I've got a separate talk, which is all about this slide and dives deep into all of these, right? But I do want to acknowledge the fact that open source is really important for developers for all these reasons. Okay, and maybe in a future day I can do that talk. What I want to do though is more focus on the business side. Okay, so first of all, let's can I get some feedback from you? Second survey. I want to understand from the people here what you think are the actual kind of main benefits. Actually, let me just I need to make sure that that's it better. Right, so you should now get hopefully a new survey. No, that's the wrong one. There we go. Apologies. Right, now we have the right survey. So what do you think is the kind of principal benefit of using open source? So I'll give people a few seconds to answer. Again, so use your phone to access the QR code, and it should prompt you with a poll. And there's 5 options, I think, or 6 options. I'll give you five or 6 seconds to enter some. So okay, I've got a few coming through already, and I'll share the results of this at the end as well, just so people can see. Actually, for people that put other, I see someone's entered other. In the chat, do you mind sharing what you think that other is, what the other benefit of open source is? I much appreciate that. So I'm going to kind of carry on though whilst you're doing that. Not surprisingly, the principal benefit of using open source is to accelerate innovation, and that's pretty much how I've seen it in the past, but also how the industry thinks of it as well. So I've touched upon developers, but why do businesses care about open source? So a couple of data points here. First of all, kind of a recent sort of audit by Black Duck. Black Duck is a company that they're an organization that have specialized over the last sort of 10-15 years in understanding open source software and helping customers secure their open source software and provide sort of legal and compliance help. And so they're specialists in this area, and they do a lot of really interesting surveys and reports. This one from last year showed that 96% of all projects within enterprises had open source software. Okay, and there are other reports you can read as well. Now, from the at the beginning of this talk, I talked about the first industrial revolution. Klaus Schwab, he wrote a paper on the 4th industrial revolution. And it's only a 24-page essay. It's very well worth reading if you can download the PDF. But what's critical in this paper is that he talks about fast, nimble, agile organizations being able to outmaneuver and be more successful than slower, bigger organizations. And so, he comes up with this really famous quote that it's not the big fish that will eat the small fish, rather it's the fast fish that will consume the slow fish. And that's important because, another quote from, I can't remember the guy's name from Netscape, Mark Anderson, I think his name is, he said that software is eating the world. Now, if software is eating the world, then open source is eating software. So open source is good for business. I'm going to talk about these areas in a lot of detail. Now, what I'm going to do, okay, is for each of these, I'm going to show, first of all, kind of explain why it's good for business, understand the kind of strategic importance for business. And then I'm going to share some techniques that I have seen and actually also implemented in my role previous to joining Amazon. I've been working in open source lifecycle for 20 years and helping many customers make the best and strategic use of open source. So before I do that though, I want to share kind of the adoption curve for open source. Now this is a map, okay, and what it shows is that if we look at how open source is being adopted from not being used in denial 0 all the way up to 5 where people are actually developing out in the open, we can see they go through this natural adoption curve. Initially, organizations will start to use open source software. Once they've started using open source software and they become more comfortable with it, they tend to champion it, and many organizations will start shifting to open source first positions. And then they'll start to look at using open source managed services. Now, a lot of organizations tend to stop there, okay? And if we look at the purple arrows, we can see that in the use phase, okay, we again, according to data from Black Duck, 100% of all organizations are now using open source software. When it comes to actually championing and operationalizing using managed services, that figure goes down to 73%. Now, the gap between 3 and 4 is the gap between consuming and contributing to open source software. Okay, so collaborate is where you start taking baby steps, start joining projects and making some changes, submitting some changes, maybe providing some resources to work on an open source project. Whereas 5 is actually you're deciding to create a project out in the open, allowing other people to join your project as resources. Now we see this this gap, and the data there. Only 23% of enterprises are at the stage 4 and stage 5, which begs the question: what is stopping businesses from making the most of those open source opportunities? Because what we see, is that the value of adoption going up is high, and I'm going to come into details as to what that is. And so, organizations, if they stop at 3, they're missing out on all that value. And what we see, and the purpose of the rest of this session, is it's that lack of implementing a strategy for open source that is stopping them from moving beyond consumption. So this is now the next slide. So the next poll, which I'm going to have to so for those people who are using open source within your organizations today, I'd like to very much know what level on that continuum you are currently on. Are you in stage 0? Are you still not using open source at all? Are you using it and standardizing it? Or are you actually now beginning to start contributing? So let's see how people, okay, so I think certainly from the responses so far, it seems like most people are using it and championing it, which is kind of what I expect. No one so far is in stage 4 or stage 5, which is actually quite common for this size of meeting. Okay, so now I want to talk about actually, how open source can provide businesses with strategic advantages, specifically talking about the techniques you can leverage. So the first one is around knowing your customer. Okay, so we are now in the customer-centric kind of era. And it's important. Customers have got more choice than ever. So treating your customers and knowing your customers is really, really important. And working on open source projects allows you to work more closely with your customers. Projects have to earn the trust of their customers with everything they do. And so over time, a number of techniques have evolved that projects have used to attract and retain their user base, which apply to businesses. So one of those techniques is actually how you build trust with your customers. So as an example, and these are just some techniques, okay, there are more. Increasingly, organizations are developing their roadmaps publicly, and AWS has, even last week, we launched our AWS Spot Instances roadmap out on GitHub. Previous to that, we've got containers, Amplify, and another of our service roadmaps have been open source, but many other companies are doing this as well. Okay, so being very transparent about what we're planning to do, what we're planning to deliver, so that our customers can help shape that conversation. RFCs on new designs. So request for comment is where within a technology project, you state this is what we're trying to do, and you allow people to input on that design. From a transparency perspective, using open source allows potential new customers to see your code and have more of a confidence that you are someone that they can work with. And that also reduces risk. So, if you disappear, they've still got the source code. In fact, I would say that, having worked in technology over 30 years, probably in the first 20 of that, I ran into many client engagements where there was battles around who could have access to source code. And many of you, maybe that might resonate. Source code is not always a given. And even, up until last year, I was working with a public sector company who had working with a third-party company who were very reluctant to release their source code. So, being able to have that source code and if for an application that you're using allows you to reduce risk. But the other thing is there are lots of other techniques, that you can do to help build trust with your customer. So that's the first technique. The second technique is how do you get feedback from customers? One of the things that you know, when you're developing products, is how you get the right feedback from your customers to shape the product design. And this is where, you know, open source really shines. Once you get code into customers' hands so they can kick the tires, they can try it out for you, and they can, you know, test it in more ways, in more different platforms, in different scenarios than you could ever do yourself. So, you know, it provides a great mechanism for you to make sure that you've got feedback from customers on how to run it, but also on how they use it, which you can then use to create better products. And, you know, at Amazon, we have this this two-pizza team model. And one of the key things about two-pizza teams is that it reduces the barriers between the engineers and the builders and their customers. And this is what you see in open source, right? You know, open source reduces the barriers between the coders in those projects and the people using it, which is often one of the, you know, the hardest things to do. So getting feedback fast as developers helps you improve those products more quickly, and, you know, help satisfy those customers. And then the third technique that I'm going to talk about very quickly is force multiplier. So by removing, you know, undifferentiated heavy lifting from customers and using managed services, you can, for example, that might be, you know, supporting or running off patches. It could be running, you know, fully managed services. You know, this allows you to kind of like increase the appeal of certain open source software. So these are kind of three techniques. There are more techniques, but I just want to give you a flavor. And I'm going to come at the end of this presentation to, you know, how you might use these. So knowing your customer is an important business imperative. Open source has shown how open source projects can do this. These are all techniques that you can use within your own business. Now, some questions. Let me just make sure there's no questions. Okay. No, okay. It's still on this slide. So I haven't got many slides, so it's still on this one. Okay, right. So next slide, okay, is entering and disrupting market. And this is actually probably, before I joined Amazon, this is probably one of the ones that I used to work most with my customers, okay? So this is where open source can be used as a tactic if you want to enter or disrupt an existing market. So if you think back, okay, in technology, maybe look at the browser wars, and, you know, we can think of, you know, how when Netscape browser dominated, actually that's a bad example, when IE dominated as a proprietary product, the Chromium browser, which was open source, emerged. And if we look at the market share now, not only has it overtaken Edge and Explorer, but it's created an ecosystem of other browsers built on the Chromium core. And you can see this with the databases as well, where, you know, there was a move to move off a Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle. So MySQL and other sort of open source databases came in to kind of enter and disrupt existing markets. So some of the techniques that you can use, and the first one is, you know, getting what I call getting developer mindshare. So this is providing tools as well as using the right open source licenses to enable developers to build on your service or application. So what you're doing here, okay, is that once developers know your technology, they'll use it and adopt it in the way they work, in the way they do work for customers, and the way they potentially build products as well. And effectively what you're doing is you're converting your users and developers to be advocates of your product. Now, some really good examples of this today. If anyone is familiar with WordPress or Drupal, you will notice that there is a big market of extensions, themes, plugins. And, you know, what WordPress and Drupal have managed to do is, you know, create this, you know, environment where these developers are contributing to making their product much more compelling. The next technique is kind of like what I call loss leader, which is like a technique which is not always applicable, but can work well where needed. And where you want to sell something, you look for a complementary service that customers need. So as an example, if we look at Google, Google is a search and media company, and they needed to make sure that they could continue to control how people entered terms for searching, and that led them to create Chrome. It led them to create the Android operating system to make sure that they could better deliver ads in those environments. If you look at Intel, they sell CPUs, and they've got a lot of work in operating systems to make sure that those are optimized for their chips. So you can see that sometimes open source is a useful way of to make sure that the core business product you've got has got the right market, or rather has got you can put it in front of the customers and users you need to make sure that your product is getting the data or the footfall you need. The next technique, which is one I've used for customers, is what I call funnel for expertise. So this is similar to kind of like the technical complement one, but this is where you kind of like use open source as a business development tool to generate potential leads or customers through the process of generating some kind of data. Now that data that's produced is something that you as an organization understand better than anyone else and can leverage to upsell. So I've used this successfully before with an organization that wanted to enter a new market into cybersecurity. They produced a free tool, which was really, really useful. It produced some output, which was useful to the customer, but it produced a lot of extra information that was really only useful to the company that created the tool. So what would happen is that you would get some value and utility from using this tool, but if you wanted to understand in more detail and more depth how to understand that information, or you wanted to work with them to kind of customize the tool in a way that was more efficiently done by them, then you could engage with them and it allowed them to generate effectively a business around this. So that's kind of like a very effective model that a lot of organizations are doing. And what's interesting about this one is that the fact that you're open sourcing that tool means that your competitors can use those tools. But if you have got the right expertise and they don't, then whilst other people can run the tool, they won't necessarily be able to provide the same utility for customers. So again, the customer wins, because as long as you are providing the right value for your customer, they will come back to you because you're the one that can provide the best insights on the data that's produced. So the next one is innovation, which is the one that most people voted for. So not surprising is that open source is all about standing on the shoulders of giants, but it's also about lowering the barrier to experimentation. This process of downloading, trying, discarding kind of projects that you can use potentially. But it's also about increasing the diversity of thoughts and skills and ideas. If you think as an organization that you work for, when you create products today, you're working with the pool of resources you have within your organization. When you work with open source, you're working with a much broader pool that've got different backgrounds, different ideas, and being able to take that and bring it inside your organization is really, really useful. Now, there are some techniques that you can use, and I've got a few of them here. So the first one is called lurking and learning. And this is a technique where you can join open source projects, but effectively not do anything but shadow. So the idea here is that you shadow an open source project and learn how they do things. Now, how do they develop? How do they do that collaboratively? How do they secure their code? How do they do release management? Now, all of these things, you can learn. And I spent a lot of my early years in open source doing this, lurking in projects and getting to know people, getting to know who the right people were, and learning the processes and how they do this, and then adopting that within my own organization. So effectively being able to innovate inside the organization using these techniques that were being done open source. The next technique is lowering the barrier to experimentation, which is where you make open source components available to your builders so they can do prototyping or proof of concepts. The key here really is making and providing a self-service tool that allows that to be much more frictionless. And it also means you have to work with non-technical teams to do that, such as legal or procurement. The next one is creating, next technique is creating an ecosystem for your open source project. So kind of, I mentioned this one previously in the entering market, and this is where, you know, if you take another product, Jira or Confluence, people might be familiar with those. You may not be familiar, but both those products have got an extensive marketplace where you can extend the product. Now, in the early days, so I worked with Jira and Confluence back before it was a 1.0 product. And in those days, what was really, really important to both those products was the fact that people could create new extensions to those products and effectively elevate the product from what it was into increase it into something else. So the idea is you're providing a way for your product to continuously innovate, but other people doing it on your behalf. So again, that's a very interesting technique to how you can bolt on innovation to your existing products. So the next one is driving roadmap, and probably the one that's most relevant, I'd say, today. So if software is eating the world and open source is eating software, then how do you make sure that you take part rather than just sit on the roadside and watch? Okay, if something is strategically important to you as a business, what is going to be your approach? I was chatting to an old colleague who now works at Google. He was working at Verizon at the time, and Verizon had just announced membership of the CNCF Foundation. Now, when I spoke to him, he said is that, you know, Kubernetes was strategically important to Verizon as a business, and therefore, as a business, they wanted to make sure they could be a stakeholder in that project. So any technology that you care about, that you rely on, will typically have open source components, and you now have an ability to not just watch, okay, but to actually take part and steer. Something very different, okay, to the old way of proprietary software, where the only influence you had was paying a large license fee, but that was no guarantee of you having any influence. So techniques here around joining open source foundations, such as the one I just mentioned, directly or indirectly funding a project through things like sponsorship, or maybe hiring key developers, joining technical committees within open source projects. Another technique is actually hiring of open source builders, and hiring key developers of projects, and then funneling your existing workforce to work on those open source projects. All of these techniques allow you to help have a better chance in shaping and steering the direction and roadmap of the open source technologies that you use. The next one, which is probably the lowest hanging fruit and the one that most organizations start with because it's the easiest, is how open source is critical, I think, to attracting and retaining your technical talent. So I used to work for PwC. They do a CEO survey every year. It's really useful. And for the last few years, the number one thing that's keeping CEOs up at night is the digital skills challenge, right? How do you find, how you attract, how you retain digital talent? And, you know, many organizations begin, with this part when you're trying to align the strategic benefits with open source. So let me give you some examples. If you look at Facebook, 75% of Facebook engineering cited open source when they joined. Okay, Trivago, they sponsored Webpack, which is a product they were using, and they hired engineers. Sorry, the hired engineers for Trivago said they joined because the fact that they actually had sponsored Webpack. So, you know, there's a strong correlation between an organization's involvement and engagement in open source to its ability to hire and retain technical talent. So there's some other stats, okay, that came up from a survey a few months ago. I can't remember which one this was. I think it might have been the Octaverse one, which GitHub produces. But what it said is that developers are most successful when they open source, 62%. Developers have advanced their career via open source, 87%. And developers are investing time and effort in aligning open source as important to their career. I don't have a percentage for that one, but the idea there is that if you want to, if your business in any way or shape depends on hiring engineers, then you need to have a strong open source game. Now, some of the techniques here that organizations are using is providing some of their staff with this 20% time, focusing on open source as a personal development objective. Quite often organizations, as another technique, are using open source to help develop soft and core skills, not technical skills, but those skills. Because when you think about it, if you're working in an open source project, most of the skills that you're actually having to learn are those soft skills. How do you, in an organization, in a project that's run by volunteers, how do you convince them that your code or your design is the right design? Right, so the next one is building better products. So I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, actually. I might have to speed up. I'm actually doing very badly for time, so I'm gonna have to speed up here. Open source, there was a couple of studies done. I can share the data with you, but these two studies that were done by academia showed that open source projects had twice the quality and the developers were twice as efficient. Now, the upshot of that is that if you're building products within your organization, then learning how to do open source will give you 2 times better quality and 2 times more effective engineers. The costs. So the cost of software engineering. Let me just accelerate quickly. When you build software, if you do it yourself, it's the graph on the left-hand side, the blue one. If you use open source, then your effort is reduced, because on the right-hand side, the effort you do, which is still in blue, you can see is a lot less. Okay, so by sharing effectively the burden, building on other open source projects, you can see that over time, the amount of effort, which results in how much money you have to invest and how much money you have to spend, is significantly less. So that's the kind of in one graph, simplified the kind of pure economics of open source. Right. So very quickly, why does Amazon care about open source? Well, for a lot of the reasons that I've just talked about, knowing your customer, we build services on open source software. We act as a force multiplier for open source projects and open source communities to make sure they are healthy and succeed. Open source allows us to be more effective, more efficient, reduce our maintenance, and also we have high quality and we have better security. Now, this is the graph I showed earlier, and what this shows is that the effect and impact of cloud and open source together allows all the open source projects to rise up. So from the point of view of denial, it's very hard for an organization to deny that open source is meaningful when the cloud is built on open source software. And we have the ability to validate open source technology and projects because they're run at scale on AWS. We also use managed services to make it super easy for customers to get started. So it lowers the barrier of entry for those customers to use it, whilst giving them flexibility and option to run open source in the way that they like it. And finally, for those projects where we contribute or we build out in the open, we can help with sponsorship, or we do help with sponsorship, and we do provide engineers to upstream fixes. So cloud, and specifically AWS, we act as a force multiplier that brings all of these up. Now, very quickly, why do customers want open source services? Well, it's really three reasons. The first is that we at AWS build open source services to very high scale multi-tenanted requirements. And quite often, this is what customers want, because if you want to try and build, patch, scale, let's say an open source database, that's quite a hard challenge. So we've done the hard work. It means that you can do it and get started very quickly, but still have that confidence that it's still an open source database and you can still run that in your own data center if you wanted to. And being able to do that quickly is important to our customers, and providing options for customers, whether it's a managed service or components they can get from our marketplace, where there's hundreds of open source products, the ones you love. With a couple of clicks, you can get up and running yourself very, very quickly. And we have a large number of managed services that are built on open source across all of these different areas. I'm not going to go into details because of time. But we also have projects that we built from scratch that we let customers use, that we have contributions from third parties, and this is again just a small selection. And we also do a lot of work in raising awareness of open source projects. So a call to action here is if you've got anything interesting in open source that you want us to cover, then we are happy to talk to you and share it on our social, maybe work with you to write a blog post so we can raise awareness for our customers on your open source project. So just to wrap up the takeaway, okay, you should think of open source as levers and tactics that help deliver your business strategy. Now, tech companies with a small t now have figured this out, and they use open source, such as Amazon is one of those companies, and they use open source as a way to achieve business outcomes. Right? We're not talking about developers now. We're not talking about giving them the ability to download and use software. We're talking about those companies that have figured out how to use open source as a way to achieve business outcomes. So what does that look like? Is it might be that a company, you want to increase your brand. Perhaps you want to do this with a specific part of your organization. Maybe you want to build a world-class engineering team. So what you need to do is you need to align those specific business strategies and goals with open source. And that will allow you to make sure that you're more likely to align open source to help achieve those business goals. Now, the best practice to do this says that you should set up an open source program office, or OSPO as it's called. Now, sometimes if you're a small company, this can be a virtual function that's done by one person, but you can also hire people to do this for you and help you to do this for you. But it has to be a defined role so that you understand the levers and how you can use that to achieve your business goals. So, the other key thing here, and why the chief is on the right-hand side, is that you can't do this unless you've got executive sponsorship. Okay, that's really, really important, because they need to provide validation to decide what you want to do. And then it's your job to then align how open source can help achieve it. So as an example, if you want to build, if your strategy as a company is to be a world-class tech company, then one of the business goals is going to be build a world-class engineering function. If you want to do that, then open source will help you achieve that objective through some of the techniques I shared with you. The biggest mistake I have seen is that business, let me start again. The biggest mistake I have seen is business thinking of open source as just software that they can download and use, okay? And I think that that's the key mistake that I see over and over again. And so going back to the beginning of this slide, I would like you to sort of think about who is your chief open source officer. So thank you very much. That's pretty much me done. I run a weekly newsletter that covers open source. That's the address. You can access it if you want. I've used a lot of pictures in this presentation and in good open source practices to share attribution. Those are the photographers. And thank you very much for your time. Now I've got time for questions, so apologies for running over my allotted time.
Oh, you're more than welcome, Ricardo, and thank you very much for that. Just to put this one out to the group, if anyone, I have been asking for questions throughout the session. If anyone has any questions, if you want to pop them into Q&A just now. Ricardo, my kind of first point or first observation, and it's really just looking back at that point that you mentioned regarding executive sponsorship. Do you think that, or from your experience or from what there, that one of the kind of biggest areas of resistance come around a perception of risk and trust, with the kind of executive sponsorship, maybe believing that the open source, there is a risk element there, or there's a trust element there? Has that been your experience? Has that been one of the barriers?
It definitely has. In fact, there is I'm about to do some blog posts on this specific area, right? Right. One of the initial barriers, if you work in a big enterprise, the challenges you will nearly always come up with are your risk and compliance teams and your legal and procurement teams. Okay, they all have different concerns. Procurement are very happy in their lovely cozy relationships, getting vendor kickbacks and all that kind of stuff. They don't understand how to work with open source. Legal tend to be more risk averse. They want an easy life. Yeah. And they don't understand open source. R&Q they tend to vary. They tend to be similarly aligned to most risk organizations that I've worked with, is that they like an easy life. They want to do as little as possible. And this is a big exaggeration. I do say this tongue in cheek. And so it's about really education, helping them understand what this thing is, right? So techniques I've used to help bridge those barriers. The first one is go on a big education and effectively evangelism tour within an organization. So there are normally groups within a business. If it's a big business, that you'll find these that are very pro AWS and will help you. And the idea here is running sessions with people like procurement, legal, to help them understand why it's important to them, and then help them explain. What you're doing in this process, okay, is you're helping them to understand what this thing is. You're helping them to understand why it's relevant to their job, and then you're giving them tools and the techniques, okay, to deal with it and make them look good in the business. I think that's a really key thing here. You've got to make them look good in the business. Yeah. With R&Q, it's about creating workflows, and we talk about this in Amazon, a self-service kind of like platforms without gatekeepers. So one of the things that I've effectively done is create these kind of like very simply on using things like Google Forms. Ask a series of questions, and the outcome of that will tell you, yes, you can use open source, or we need to have a quick chat with you to understand more about what you're doing. 80% of most requests don't need to bother the R&Q people, right? But they just need a way to scale. And again, they need a way so they can be made to look good. The biggest challenge though is how to find your executive sponsor, right? And I think this is where it's really important to not speak about open source in technology terms. It's about talking about open source in improving your brand, in hiring the right, or making it easier to hire and retain people, about increasing your revenue, or helping you be more efficient so you lower your costs. So talk about it in terms that they care about, and present it that way, okay? And I think that's how you get your executive sponsorship. It's worked for me every single time, and there are always within every organization those executives, either up and coming or already there, that are looking for those new angles to make a name for themselves. And that's typically who I have latched on. But the important thing is to present it in business terms. But your job really is to know how that then maps to programs of work, or I call them techniques here, of actually how you do it.
Okay. That's bringing us up just before 6 o'clock, Phil. I'm understanding as you've got to be finished for 6.
I can say a couple more minutes, don't worry.
The other question that I had was kind of related to that, and was when you mentioned there the point about talent, and obviously working across a number of different universities, it's students are often encouraged to use a variety of different open source tools. Could you kind of explain how that could be used as a kind of driver within the organisation? Because obviously, and I don't like using the phrase "the war for talent," but it is a very competitive landscape. Minimal amount of good talent coming into the market. So how could an organisation use the move towards open source to become the destination of choice for emerging talent?
So organizations have to, so from the point of view of being how you attract and hire talent, I gave the example of Facebook and Trivago, okay? Yep. So as a builder, okay, as a technologist, you will typically have criteria as kind of the organizations that you're looking to join, okay? And increasingly, in fact, actually this happened a few weeks ago. We had an engineer who was about to join, but he was not sure about how we supported open source. So I had a call with him. I told him about our open source policy, how we totally support engineers working on open source projects, that he can continue working on open source projects. And that was all it took for him to sign. Yeah. It's less about, so as a business, okay, you have to be sufficiently intentional in your strategy around, wanting, or rather how you engage with developers. There are some pitfalls though, right? So this is not just as straightforward as just hiring people. One of the issues I've seen is people want to hire open source developers, and then when they get in, they don't have the right policies, they don't have the projects, and therefore they basically leave. They leave within a few weeks because they realize that we were sold on this thing doesn't happen, right? That's one thing. The other pitfall is that organizations may be seen as poachers of open source staff, right? So you have to be careful. It's a delicate balancing act, which is why you need people who understand the open source landscape to drive the strategy within your business. I talk about a chief open source officer, but it's someone who is sufficiently fluent in open source, has got connections with the board to understand the business aspect, and is credible within the open source world.
Okay, fantastic. We are screaming up to 2 minutes to 6. Let's probably call it a night at that. Ricardo, thank you so much, fella. Good to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for everybody for taking part and enjoying.
Right. Thanks very much. Cheers, Ricardo. Thank you. Cheers, Rob.
All right.
See you all soon.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Care, everyone.
Take it easy.
Cheers.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.